dreamt possible. It's extraordinary. And you can see it in various ways in which experience changes so much about how the brain is wired. About a decade ago, it was reported that the hippocampus, the part of the brain that's important for spatial organization, was larger in taxi cab drivers in London than anybody else in London. And because in London, to be a taxi cab driver, you actually have to go through a course where you memorize virtually the entire street map of the city. Hard enough for me just to do the tube, the subway system, but for taxi cab drivers, it really shows up in their brains. But it's also true of people who are musicians. You can show that musicians have an auditory cortex that actually looks different. The people who have learned a second or third language, those are actually separate representations in the brain, and the distance in the brain by which those languages are represented in cortex depend on the relationship historically of those languages. The people who are blind, particularly if they're blind early in life, begin to take over the visual cortex for all kinds of other processes, and so they read Braille using their visual cortex. So the brain has this ability to adapt in ways that none of us had really fully imagined. I think flexibility is probably the key aspect of the human brain that we had failed to understand. The third way in which we've begun to understand the brain, in what I'll call a revolutionary change, is to understand that there are categories in the brain that we hadn't quite expected. The brain, the human brain, anyway, which is the one that we know best so far, not only, all of us knew that there was sort of an area for language, an area for vision, and an area for the motor cortex, but it's much, much more complex than that. There are odd kinds of ways in which the perceptual world is organized. It's not what we would think. So there's a separate category for tools and for animate objects. And for those things that sort of cross over, like a hammer that looks like a person, it gets a little bit crazy, because that's probably where you actually have overlapping turf. But who would think necessarily that those were such important areas to keep separate? But they are. There's, I mentioned before, separate territories for different languages. There's separate territories for different kinds of animate objects. So you have a face area. It's very well developed and becomes an entire system. And increasingly, as we begin to delve deeper into how this weird computer is organized, what we find is that a lot of the information is actually in the circuitry. It's not like we used to think of, here's, in sort of a geographical way, that this is your language area and this is your motor area. In fact, the visual area or visual function is distributed around 28 or 30 different parts of the cortex. And that's true for the way we see faces, the way that we put perception together. It's a vast network of areas that are connected together in ways that are, again, very adaptive and very flexible. I guess the last thing I would say is that as we look at this organ, in line with what Ambrose Bierce said exactly 100 years ago, I think we have to be honest that we still don't understand how it works. That we can think about it in these different metaphors, whether it is in fact a computer of some sort or whether it is in fact a complex, adaptive, rewired information processing system. But we have no idea how to get from what we see in the circuitry and in the cellular organization from there to the experience of passion, love, trust, loyalty, all of the things that actually Maimonides wrote about and when he was laying out the 13 laws. We simply don't understand how complex emotion and complex function comes out of this very elegant and very complicated organ system. And it's something that I think as we delve into this over the next decade, it's where a lot of the excitement will be, is going from the kind of structural organization that we can now put our hands on, and even at the genetic level, seeing what genes are expressed, to understand how does that scale up to give somebody a particular emotional experience. It's an odd thing that if you look at the whole body, the brain is the most energetically active part of the body, even when someone's asleep, and even when people are at complete rest. The brain, it's something like 2% of your body weight. It's 10 or 20%, depending on the situation, of energy consumption. So it's a little bit like, in some ways, the electrical system of your car, and that it's got to be working, it's got to be going all the time. But it's even when it's not running, this is a system that's got to be up and driving. And we don't quite understand that, except because most of the time we look at it when it's steering the car and not when it's just humming away at rest. But that's what it does, and what it's doing most of that time. You can understand it with the heart, that it's got to pump, but what's happening with the resting brain is an area of great interest right now. So I've laid out what I think are some of the most exciting new ways that we think about the brain. But to me, what is probably the most revolutionary about all of this is the way that as we bring brain and mind together, the way it's changed the way we think about mental disorders. Because, and this really is, I think, a fundamental transformation. Increasingly, we've begun to realize, in a way that George had sort of presaged in his comments, that mental disorders can be understood as brain disorders. That doesn't mean that they're only brain disorders, but it means that we can get at them in the same way that we can understand the mind through understanding the brain. We can study mental disorders by understanding them as changes in what the brain does. Now, most of the time when you think about brain disorders, you're thinking about, well, that's the world of neurology, not psychiatry. And you'd be right, in a sense. But neurology largely studies what I call the diseases of dead cells. So whether it's Parkinson's or Huntington's or ALS or even Alzheimer's, those are places where you have big areas of the brain that are dead. You have lesions. Psychiatry, almost by definition, is working on the problems of brain circuits. It might be helpful even to think about it in terms of, again, the heart metaphor, that instead of having a myocardial infarction, which will be the one way of having the heart malfunction, here you have a conduction defect, which also happens in the heart and causes the heart to malfunction. But when you look at a heart with a conduction defect, you don't see an area of dead cells. You don't see a big necrotic spot. And that's what we've got here. We've got diseases of brain circuits. Now, that's so much hand-waving until you have the ability to actually study that. And we do. For the first time, we really can begin to study the circuits in the brain. And we can study them in a way that gives us a certain precision to know how things are wired, how things are functionally connected, as well as how they're wired, and what might be different about the way that this happens in depression, in schizophrenia, in autism, in bipolar disorder, in anorexia. There's another way in which we should think about these disorders as brain disorders that are quite separate from the neurological kinds of brain disorders, and that is that they are almost all, disorders of early life. If you look at most people with a mental illness, what is so striking about these illnesses relative to the rest of medicine is that they occur early. These are really the chronic disorders of young people. 50% of those with a mental illness have onset by age 14 and 75% by age 24. So you're talking about a very different picture than Alzheimer's, Huntington's, Parkinson's, and those disorders that have that kind of late onset that are degenerative. These, in fact, are disorders of brain circuits, but they're developmental by nature, and that means that they're disorders that have to do with the way that the circuits get laid down. There's something about the wiring and how those pathways get created across this period that's partly genetically determined and partly environmentally determined. Remember, I said that this is the amazing thing about this brain, is that it has this long period of development, and that its development and its wiring is remarkably adaptive and responsive to what's going on in the environment. And all of that can tell you something about how these may come about. Now, part of why I focus so much on the fact that these are brain disorders and not simply mental disorders is because it forces us to think very differently about the kinds of questions we ask. For one thing, it brings a whole different science to the table. It means that neuroscience becomes kind of the basic science for understanding mental disorders, not just using psychology or behavioral science as we've done for the last century. It brings a lot of other power to the table. It also raises a whole set of questions. So questions that may have somewhat to do with mechanisms of illness and questions that have something to do with treatment as well. That can't happen fast enough. I don't know how much you know about the public health dilemma that we're facing in this country, and that's why these events from last weekend are so important for us to address in a way that goes way beyond this case, but to think more broadly about the challenge that comes about from mental illness. Let me just quickly go through some numbers with you. If you ask the question, what medical illnesses cause the most disability in America today? Most people would say, oh, it's obvious, it's cancer, heart disease, stroke. Those are the three big killers. And you'd be right, those are the three big killers, but they are not the three big sources of disability. The biggest single source of disability, accounting for about 30%, 28% of all disability in this country, are the neuropsychiatric, the mental disorders, along with substance abuse, severe alcohol abuse as well. People always say that just can't be, it doesn't sound right. And they'd say that because they're thinking about the big killers, but disability occurs for three reasons. High prevalence, which these have, 6% of the country has a severe mental illness. Early onset, which, as I just mentioned to you, all of these have. They start early in life, and sometimes we use the term chronic, sometimes it's better to say remitting, relapsing, but they last a lifetime generally. So this is a huge problem. And they are, in fact, severe. So people with these illnesses are the largest group of medical patients who are on SSI, SSDI, on disability relief in this country. The second piece of this is not just that they cause high rates of disability, or what in medical terms we call morbidity, but they have very high rates of mortality. These are killers. Now, they're not killers in the sense that maybe these cancer, heart disease, and stroke would be killers, but they're killers in the sense that in two ways really. One is a very high rate of suicide.